The day my brother pulled out his phone to call the moving company, before our grandmother's lawyer had even finished speaking, was the day I finally understood something I'd spent 37 years trying not to believe. He had never thought I counted. My name is June Harlow. I'm 37 years old. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia, and I work as a property assessor for the regional district. Not glamorous. Not the kind of career that gets announced at family dinners. But it's steady. It requires precision, and it means I understand better than most people what land is actually worth. Not just the number on a tax assessment, but the weight of it, the responsibility of it. What it costs to keep something alive over decades. My brother's name is Brett. No, wait, I need to start further back than that, because none of what happened at that dining room table in October makes any sense unless you understand what our grandmother's farm meant, and what my family had spent years quietly deciding without ever saying it out loud. My grandmother, Iris Calloway, came to the Okanagan in 1971 with my grandfather, a man named Douglas, who died before I was born. They had 43 acres outside of Oliver. Apple and cherry trees mostly, plus a small vineyard they planted in the early 80s, when the valley was just beginning to figure out what its soil could do. By the time I was born, Calloway Orchard had a name people recognized at the farmers markets in Penticton. Nothing corporate, nothing flashy. Just fruit that tasted the way fruit is supposed to taste, and a farmhouse that always smelled like cinnamon and warm wood and something green coming through the screen door. I spent every summer there until I was 16. My brother, Gavin, spent most of those summers somewhere else. That's the part I used to soften when I told this story. I'd say, Gavin was busy with hockey, or Gavin had his own things going on. Both of those were true. What I left out was that Gavin didn't particularly want to be at the farm, and my grandmother knew it, and neither of them ever made a fuss about it. He would come for Christmas and maybe a long weekend in July, eat whatever she'd made, make her laugh, and leave. She loved him. I'm not saying she didn't, but love and trust are different things, and I think she understood that better than any of us realized. My parents treated the farm like it was already settled. Not in any conversation they ever had with me directly, but in the way families communicate the things they've decided. Offhandedly, in passing, in the assumptions buried inside every other sentence. When Gavin takes over the farm, my mother said once, standing at the kitchen counter at her house in Kamloops, not even looking up from what she was doing. I was 29 at the time. I was home for Thanksgiving. I remember I was holding a dish towel. Grandma hasn't said anything about that, I said. June. She gave me a look. Gavin is the one who's going to stay close to home. You know how these things work. I did not push back. I never did. Not really. Not about things like this. There was a script in my family about who I was. Capable, yes, reliable, sure, but also somehow beside the point. And I had spent so long living alongside that script that I'd almost started to believe it myself. Gavin, for his part, had never been subtle. He moved to Summerland with his girlfriend 3 years ago, about 40 minutes from Oliver, which my mother called coming home, even though Gavin had grown up in Kamloops just like I had. He started dropping by the farm more often. He would bring takeout from town and sit with my grandmother on the porch and talk about plans. He told anyone who would listen that he was thinking about modernizing operations. He mentioned solar panels. He mentioned agri-tourism. He mentioned a name for the new tasting room he wanted to add. My grandmother listened to all of it. She smiled and asked questions and refilled his coffee. She never told him yes, but he heard yes anyway, because he was the kind of person who only listened for the parts that confirmed what he already wanted. I kept coming to the farm too, just differently. I came in March to help prune before bud break, because I'd learned how years ago, and my grandmother's hands had started hurting in the cold. I came in August during the cherry harvest and spent 3 weekends in a row hauling bins and dealing with whatever the picking crew needed. I came in November to help shut things down for winter, drain the lines, cover what needed covering. I booked my vacation time around the farm schedule. I didn't think of it as anything other than what needed doing. My grandmother and I would talk in the evenings. Real conversations. About the property, about the soil, about what had changed in the 40 years she'd been there, and what she thought was coming. She'd ask about my work and actually listen to the answer. She told me once, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine from a neighbor's vineyard, that the thing she respected most about me was that I never needed her to say thank you. I thought she was just being kind. In September, she had a small stroke. She recovered well. She was stubborn about it. Stubborn in the best possible way, back on her feet and giving the home care nurses instructions within 2 weeks. But everyone understood what it meant. She was 81. The question that had been hovering at the edge of every family gathering suddenly had a timeline. Gavin drove to Oliver the weekend. She came home from the hospital. I know this because my mother called to tell me as though it were news worth sharing. "He's been so wonderful," she said. "He's been over there every other day. He's been helping her figure out the estate." "What does that mean, helping her figure out the estate?" "Oh, you know, practical things, talking things through." I drove down the following weekend. I didn't announce it. I just showed up with groceries and a new pair of garden gloves. And we spent most of Saturday outside even though it was cool, because she wanted to look at the trees, and I wanted to be with her. She seemed clear-eyed, sharper than I expected. She asked me about a property dispute case I'd been working on, and we talked about easement law for 20 minutes, and she knew exactly what she was talking about. She told me she had an appointment with her lawyer the following week. She did not tell me what for. I didn't ask. She passed away in the first week of October, quietly in her own bed, which was exactly what she would have wanted. She was 81 years old, and she had spent 60 of those years building something that mattered and taking care of the people in her orbit, even the ones who didn't notice she was doing it. The family gathering to hear the will was at the farmhouse. That was her instruction, apparently. Her lawyer, a man named Mr. Ashworth, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years, drove down from Penticton. He was older, deliberate, the kind of man who doesn't apologize for taking up space in a room. There were 8 of us there, my parents, Gavin and his girlfriend, Paige, my aunt from Cranbrook and her husband, me. Gavin got there before me. He'd been there the whole day before, actually. He and Paige had driven down the night prior to make sure the house was ready, which I later understood meant he'd already walked through every room, opened every cupboard, and decided which pieces of furniture he was keeping. When I arrived, he was standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee like he already lived there. Paige was rearranging things on the kitchen shelf. My parents were in the living room with my aunt. Mr. Ashworth was at the dining room table, a dark leather folder in front of him, not talking to anyone. Gavin looked up when I walked in. "Hey, wasn't sure you were coming? Why wouldn't I be coming?" He shrugged, the kind of shrug that carries a lot of weight. "Just figured it might be hard for you, the drive and everything. I am 4 hours away. I have driven to this farm at least 40 times in my adult life. I'm fine," I said. He nodded and turned back to his coffee. We sat down around the table at noon. Mr. Ashworth opened the folder without ceremony. He explained that Iris Calloway had updated her will 18 months ago, a detail that made my mother's chin come up slightly, and that he had also been instructed to present a secondary document once the will itself was read. He read the will first. The house and the orchard operation, the trees, the equipment, the harvesting infrastructure, were left in a family trust. The trust had been established, it turned out, 11 years ago. The purpose of the trust was to keep the property intact and in family hands. A trustee had been designated by my grandmother personally. Mr. Ashworth paused there. He looked around the table. Gavin was already nodding, starting to sit forward in his chair, the way people do when they're anticipating being called on. Mr. Ashworth said, "My name. June Harlow has been designated sole trustee and managing authority of the Calloway Family Trust, effective as of the date of Iris Calloway's passing." I don't remember the exact sound the room made. It wasn't loud. It was more like the air pressure changed. My mother said, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Mr. Ashworth repeated it. Gavin put his coffee cup down on the table. He didn't say anything immediately. Paige looked at him. My aunt looked at my parents. My father looked at his hands. Then Gavin laughed. It was a short laugh, a disbelieving one. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Mr. Ashworth said. He said it the way people say things when they've been in a room like this before and know exactly how it goes. "She wanted me involved," Gavin said. He was still talking to the lawyer, not to me. We had conversations. She knew I was planning to be here, to take over operations. We talked about it. "Your grandmother was aware of those conversations," Mr. Ashworth said. He reached into the folder and removed a second envelope. It was sealed, cream-colored, and had my grandmother's handwriting on the front, the same small, slanted cursive she'd used on birthday cards my whole life. "To be read when the family is together." He broke the seal. He unfolded several pages. The room was completely silent. He began reading. "If you're hearing this, then I've already gone, and you're all sitting around my dining room table, probably with coffee, probably a little uncomfortable with each other. That's all right. You've always been a little uncomfortable with each other. I love you all anyway." Someone, my aunt, I think, made a small sound. "I want to explain my decision, because I think some of you will be surprised, and I don't want anyone to feel it came from nowhere. Gavin, I love you. You are charming and optimistic, and you make me laugh, and those are genuine gifts. But charm is not the same as care, and optimism without follow-through is just a mood. You talked to me about plans for this land. You had many plans. In the 11 years since I established this trust, you helped me with one harvest, and you came at Christmas most years, and you called when you remembered. I am not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand the difference between meaning well and showing up." June showed up. My throat closed. She came in March when the cold made my hands useless. She came in August without being asked and without telling anyone she was coming. She learned what I needed to know, and then she came back and helped me do it. She sat with me on this porch for more hours than I can count, and she was never just waiting for me to finish talking. She understood this land, not as something to modernize, or brand, or monetize, but as something alive that requires a relationship. The farm does not need a business plan. It needs someone who will show up in March. I trust June with this because she has already earned it, in the way that matters, not with words, but with years. Gavin stood up. It wasn't dramatic, exactly, but it was deliberate. He pushed back his chair and walked out through the kitchen to the back porch. Paige followed him. My parents sat very still. My mother had her hands flat on the table, looking at them. My father kept his eyes down. Mr. Ashworth finished reading. There were some additional details. A small personal bequest to my aunt. A piece of jewelry for my mother. Certain items to be distributed as specified in a handwritten list that was filed with the estate. He answered the questions my parents asked, calmly and thoroughly. He made no editorial comments. When he was finished, he handed me the trust documents, the property records, and an envelope labeled with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a key. The spare key to the farmhouse, and a single index card with her handwriting on it. The Honeycrisp block needs a new irrigation line on the east side. You already know this. Don't let anyone talk you into the cheap option. I held that card for a long time. The room slowly cleared. My parents went outside. My aunt made tea. At some point, Gavin came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. I don't understand it, he said. I know. I was here. I was willing to take it on. I know you were, I said, and I meant it in the plainest sense. He had been willing. Willingness is real. It just isn't the same thing as all those mornings at 5:30 when the frost was still on the ground and I was pulling on my boots in the dark. So what happens now? He asked. The farm stays in the family, I said. That's what she wanted. Nobody's being cut out. He looked at me for a long moment. The anger was there. I could see it, but underneath the anger there was something more complicated. Something that looked a little like recognition. He nodded once and went back outside. I sat alone at the dining room table for a few minutes. Through the window, I could see the rows of trees, the last of the apple leaves still holding on, that particular gold orange that only happens in the Okanagan in October when the light is low and sideways in the afternoon. I'd seen that light dozens of times from this exact window. It had always looked like home to me, even when I wasn't sure if that was a feeling I was allowed to have. My grandmother had known what she was doing for a long time, longer than any of us had understood. She hadn't told me, hadn't warned me, hadn't given me any signal I could point to. She had simply watched, quietly, the way she watched the weather and the way she watched the soil. She had made her decision 11 years ago and trusted it. I thought about all the times I'd pulled into that gravel driveway and not told anyone I was coming. How I'd never kept track of the times, never thought to count them as anything other than ordinary. How I'd never once framed it in my head as doing something for her. It had just felt like what the situation required. She had been paying attention to exactly that. To the doing without framing. To the showing up without accounting for it. I stood up, folded the index card carefully, and put it in my jacket pocket. I walked through the kitchen, through the back door, out onto the porch, where the October light was doing what it does, and the air smelled like apples and wood smoke and the particular cold that comes off the lake when the season is turning. The east irrigation line in the Honeycrisp block had been on my mind for 2 seasons. I'd mentioned it to her last spring, and she'd said she knew, she was thinking about it. Now it was mine to think about. That afternoon, once everyone had left or settled, I walked the property by myself, all 43 acres. I hadn't done that in a while. Done it slowly, not in a hurry to get somewhere. I walked the rows of apple trees in the last of the afternoon light. I went down to the vineyard and looked at what needed attention before the snow came. I stood at the edge of the property, where it meets the neighboring lot, and looked back at the farmhouse with the lights coming on, inside. My aunt, visible through the window, moving around the kitchen. My grandmother had built something that would outlast her. She hadn't built it alone. Nobody builds something like that alone. But she'd been the one tending it, in season and out, for 40 years, and she'd chosen someone to carry it forward not because of bloodlines or proximity or charm, but because she'd been watching, patient as the trees, for someone who already understood what it cost to keep something alive. I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I'm still not sure, honestly. But I walked back across the field in the last of the light, and the gravel crunched under my boots, and the farmhouse door was unlocked the way it always was, and I went inside. The farm doesn't need a business plan. It needs someone who will show up in March. And March, I already knew, was coming.